Welcome everyone to the Brooklyn Rail's 180th New Social Environment. I'm Henry Addison, and I have the pleasure and privilege of being your MC today for a conversation between Jeanne Silverthorne and Douglas Dreishpoon. We're also thrilled to have the poet Kate Colby here, who will read to close today's program. To begin, I ask you to join me in acknowledging the Wappinger, Canarsie, Munsee, and Lenni Lenape people of the Delaware Nation and Shinnecock Indian Nation, the traditional owners of the unceded land and waters on which we stand. The Brooklyn Rail recognizes the illegal annexation of the Republic of Artsakh as a grave international injustice. We stand in support of the Armenian people and the global Armenian diaspora. Finally, the Brooklyn Rail stands in solidarity with the uprisings in response to the murders of George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, Tony McDade, Nina Pop, David McAtee, James Scurlock, Jamel Floyd, Ahmaud Arbery, Rayshard Brooks, Rhea Milton, Dominique Remy Fells, Toyin Salau, Walter Wallace Jr., and countless others we have lost to white supremacy and police violence in this country. And acknowledge that justice will come from the streets, from the nation demanding accountability and refusing to move on until Black Lives Matter in the eyes of the state. Before I introduce our guest and host, we'd like to begin with a brief moment of silence. Thank you. And now to introduce today's guest and host. Our guest, Jeanne Silverthorne, is a prominent sculptor known for her characteristic cast rubber process and the arresting sculptures and installations that result from it. For more than 3 decades, she has taken the artist studio as her subject and centered her work around themes of age and decay, though not without gestures to humor, hope, and humanity. Her current exhibition at the University of Kentucky Art Museum, titled Jeanne Silverthorne, More Flesh and Bone, is open through February 13th in the new year, so there's still plenty of time to catch it if you're in the area. We should also all keep our eyes peeled for her upcoming interview in the January-February issue of Sculpture magazine. Our host today, Douglas Dreishpoon, is Chief Curator Emeritus at the Albright Knox and currently the director of the Catalog Raisonné project at the Helen Frankenthaler Foundation in New York. His 26 years of experience in museums include such roles as curator of collections at the Weatherspoon Art Museum at the University of North Carolina at Greensboro, and curator of contemporary art at the Tampa Museum of Art in Florida. Douglas is a consulting editor at the Brooklyn Rail. Douglas, please take it away.
Thank you. Thank you, Henry. It's a pleasure to be here. I want to thank the Rail staff, Nick, and everyone else, Fong, for organizing what's become an amazing series of conversations. You guys are the little blue engine. So you continue chugging along, and as you chug along, you gain ever more momentum. So it's a pleasure to be here. Jeanne, just a few remarks before Jeanne and I we've got a few slides, not many, but we wanted to use the slides to pace our conversation. But a few little preliminary remarks about Jeanne, who I've known now for, I guess it's more than 30 years. It's like this crazy amount of time. We've been talking ever since we met in the early 80s. And when I met her, I knew her really through her byline, and she was writing at that point, and she was writing a lot. She was writing very astute criticism, and probably making art at the same time, but in a way, in her bylines in Art Forum, Art in America, Arts, they seemed to rise above what was being made. And in a way, I think Jeanne Jeanne, you are one of those people that have flown in very splendid ways under the art world's radar. And I say that with a great deal of respect, because I think it's a really great status to have. Why? Because it may enable folks who have that and wear that suit to be productive, and be productive in ways where they're not deflected or intimidated or abused by a system that is more about spectacle and fame than it is about creative ideas. So I wanted to say that right up front, because I think that that's something that you've while isn't to say that your career isn't in a remarkable place. So anybody looking at your bio will see, and the bio is accessible. Jeanne's data will appear in the chat. I mean, the rail will make it available. It's easy to see that Jeanne has had a rather stellar career. But consistently, Jeanne, you've worked in ways that, you know, not defy the system, but work parallel with the system in ways that you never have compromised your integrity. And for that, and that's saying a lot. So why don't we let's go to the first slide and start with start at the beginning. So Jeanne, here we are. This was an installation at David and Rennie McKee's gallery. It was a piece made in 1994. It was shown in 1995, and it became the cover of a catalog, a really great show that was at the Institute of Contemporary Art in Philadelphia. Ingrid Schaffner curated the show, and Joanna Isaac interviewed you for that publication. And some very, very interesting and great things came out of that project. The piece is dark as night. It's a chandelier. It's exposed with intestine-like wires that run in all directions in a very chaotic way. There's an exit sign on the wall, but what is supposed to be illuminated and full of light is black as death. So what's being mourned here? And you know, who's doing the mourning?
Well, first of all, let me also say that I think this is a fantastic series. I'm very happy to be here, and thank you, Doug, for that very wonderful introduction. I just need to correct one little matter of fact, which is that Judith Tannenbaum was the curator of the show at the ISA in Philadelphia, but Ingrid Schaffner contributed a wonderful essay. And Ingrid and I worked together a little bit later on her show, Deep Storage, as well. But that was Judith Tannenbaum's curatorial effort. Interesting that you're asking me what's being mourned here. What's being, you know, because I thought I was going to talk about light in connection with this piece. And because so much of my work has incorporated light bulbs that are blacked out or that don't give off any light or what have you. And of course, I apologize to those of you who have heard this a million times. I have, since the 90s, been interested in the notion of the studio, something that is to be mourned also. That it's, you know, in ruin, it's dilapidated for many, many reasons. Again, this will sound deeply familiar, but certainly by the 90s, you know, we were seeing the beginning of, you know, post-studio production because of all kinds of things. The beginning of the digital age, the rise of real estate costs, et cetera. Although I loved being in the studio, for me, it's Virginia Woolf's room of one's own. It's a shelter, it's privacy, it's the inside of my head. You know, it's not a tradition that would have included me or people of color. It's a tradition, it's a place where basically you were expected to find the individual genius and who was Western, who was white, who was male. So for all these reasons, you know, the studio seemed to me, still seems to me, kind of a place of ruin, yet a place that I love. So the way I could go on was by treating it as an archaeological site, excavating it, sort of salvaging things from it by inventorying it, etc. So one thing that's being mourned is the studio itself. And in this particular piece, as you point out, you can't see it very well on the slide, on the wall is one of the things I was doing in this excavating the studio was, you know, copying the infrastructure, the wiring and the plumbing, and picking up pieces of debris and enlarging them and taking photographs and all that. But in copying the infrastructure, one of the things I would do is copy, say, for instance, the exit sign that's over the door of my studio. So this is a black rubber version of that with the kind of battery operated lights that are supposed to come on when the regular lights go out. And all the wiring that connects that item to the chandelier is based on copies of the sort of dysfunctional and functional electrical elements in the studio. The chandelier itself is kind of an anomaly. I mean, you know, I certainly didn't have a chandelier in my studio, but I had been making, you know, I've been obsessed with lighting fixtures even before this as representative ideas. You know, I had been working with the body back in the 80s. Got tired of the literalism of that and said, well, what's of the body but sort of isn't? And I thought, well, an idea. Oh, how do you give a body to an idea? What is it? What does the thought look like? But of course, cartoon imagery has already given us an icon for an idea, and that's the light bulb that goes on over the cartoon character's head when it gets an idea. So all my blacked out rubber light bulbs were, you know, not giving off any illumination. And if they were enlightenment with a small e, you know, withheld enlightenment, then this big chandelier was something else. And I didn't know what it meant. It just popped into my head. It stayed there for many years. And as is my wont, when something stays in my head that long, I start to make it even though I don't really know what it means. But as I started to make it, and I made it by hand out of clay, I realized that this wasn't just another dysfunctional lighting device. And so about the morning of, you know, ideas that don't work, this was a big antique grand or attempt at grandeur lighting device. And so it was enlightenment with a capital E. It was the Enlightenment. It was the Enlightenment philosophy that what was interesting me, what this came to represent. And what was being mourned in all that blackness was a sense that, you know, all of these systems of illumination, of enlightenment, were not working. Not even the modern backup system that's supposed to come on when the major system fails. That's blacked out. Because by the 90s, you know, these Enlightenment notions that we got from Voltaire and Diderot and all those people, that, you know, man, quote unquote, is a rational creature, that the truth will make us free, that progress is good and inevitable. You know, we knew that they weren't working. We had created with too much rationality the atom bomb, we ruined the environment, blah, 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 blah. And yet, we had nothing to replace that. Nothing with the coherence or the force of that Enlightenment philosophy. So it was sort of taking up all the room in the house of culture, this big dead item, and we were walking around in it in the same way that it was taking up all the space in my studio, if you will. So, you know, this was the beginning of a kind of mourning for, or just a noting of the way in which progressive principles that we had put so much hope in had failed us.
We have another slide of it. Henry, why don't we take a look at that? Another view. So Jeanne wrote a very cogent text for an anthology of sculpture, which is part of the Documents of 20th Century Art series that I've finished and is now at UC Press in peer review and soon to be published. And I just want to read one, you know, she encapsulated, it's titled As of Now, so it's essentially all of her thoughts around where the practice of sculpture and her own practice resides. But there's one quote that I want to pull out, which is apropos of the chandelier, where she says, "This once privileged, once patriarchal place of contemplation is now in decay. One is therefore free to excavate that ruin, unearthing the various items buried in it, ranging from its architectural details, infrastructure, and history to uncovering lost or obsolescent art genres, including that of the sculpted still life, floral relief picture, and three-dimensional portrait." And I read that because you're going to see some of those extensions as we move forward in our discussion. And Jeanne has spent a good deal of time thinking about what each of those means, and I should say, obsessively rendering each of those. So let's move to the next slide. This is a very small piece, and least we think that it's a very large garbage can. It's not. And so to look at this is to recognize that, I mean, suddenly this morning, Jeanne, I looked at the slides again and I thought, wow, it's a sarcophagus, black as night, pitch black, full of light bulbs, some of which have crashed to the floor and are now in pieces. So let's talk about bad ideas. Let's talk about big ideas versus small ideas too.
Okay, well, first of all, it's not that tiny. This is life size, literally life size.
Oh, then why do I, I'm sorry. So where are the dims here? Because I thought it was, maybe I missed that first dim.
Or maybe I got them wrong, but it's a life, these are life size. So the bulbs are the size of real bulbs. Some of them are even slightly larger bulbs.
Okay.
And the garbage can is, you know, the size of a real garbage can. Everything is rubber.
Oh, it is. Okay.
Yeah.
Fair enough.
Everything was cast. The light bulbs are also phosphorescent, so they glow in the dark.
Mm-hmm.
And just to finish the description, they're accompanied by little handmade rubber flies everywhere. And, you know, before when we were talking, Doug, we were talking about notions of failure. And, you know, one of the things I thought to myself was, well, you know, if in this studio of collapse and ruin, what else do you have? Well, you have a lot of really bad ideas, a lot of rejected ideas. And so, you know, if light bulbs are ideas, then these are rejected bad ideas. But more than that, I guess, you know, my feeling about ideas, if you will, and thoughts, is that they are of the body just as much as anything else. They literally have that kind of physical origin, that kind of physical source. And so, you know, we hatch them, they're a dime a dozen. We hatch ideas as easily as you know, chickens hatch eggs. And they're just as organic. And just like eggs, they can break open, go bad, turn into garbage, and the flies can visit them. So, you know, that's literally what was going on in my head with that piece. And in terms of failure, I mean, I think, I don't know if you want to get into the notions of failure right now, but, you know, failure is my subject matter. Failure is my muse. And making objective correlatives of failure is something that I do all the time, which is different from the actual experience of failure, say in the studio, either on a specific piece or just in general in terms of one's whole body of work.
Right. And Jeanne, you know, I mean, I'm thinking that failure can be a spectrum of possibilities too. So an idea that fails at one point in time can be resurrected and blossom at another point in time. So, you know, the notion of something failed is something to be discarded isn't necessarily so when it comes to creative, you know, how creativity might recapitulate and recycle. But, you know, I was also thinking the light is an interesting, it doesn't take an art historical mind, but you have that as well to think about Guston and Giacometti and Van Gogh's, you know, the Tavern in Arles, and even, you know, Picasso's Guernica.
Yeah, absolutely. You know, I mean, not only did I have a bare hanging light bulb in my studio, so it was part of this sort of antiquated, you know, the inventorying of the antiquated in the studio, but the bare light bulb or the light bulb with the little tin shield is almost a universally recognized icon of the studio, thanks to the paintings of Guston, to Guernica, to Giacometti's documented photos of the studio, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And yeah, you're right about failure being, you know, I've talked about failure as a kind of subject matter. But you're right, the failure can be great. Of course, this is a truism too, you know, the lucky accident, the happy accident, right? And my favorite instance of that is a few years back, I made a giant rubber sunflower, gray and white. And I made a mistake. I made a technical mistake in that the armature I put in the stem to keep it standing but slightly bent was not strong enough for the weight of the flower head. Rubber is incredibly heavy. And so it wouldn't stand up. This is also, you know, sculpture is supposed to stand up. And a lot of my work is about either a refusal to stand up, an incapacity to stand up. And certainly whenever I want something to stand up, it's a huge fight. So I was incredibly frustrated. This had taken forever to make. And I spent more months trying to make it stand up this way or the other, reinforcing things. And then within about 10 minutes, in a moment of utter frustration and utter failure, I put it up on a pedestal. I grabbed a cast rubber light bulb with tubing that I had lying around. I made a noose out of one end of it, tied it to the head of the sunflower, slung the rest of it over a pipe hanging from the ceiling, and basically had a piece in which I now had a suicidal sunflower that had, attempted to hang itself from a light bulb. And it's one of my favorite pieces. And it happened because I was completely stymied and pissed and just was going to do anything, to string this thing up and make it stand. So there's always the happy, fortunate accident. On the other hand, something just happened on my screen. Sorry, excuse me. Remind me later. I seem to have lost the PowerPoint. Anyway, I can talk without it. On the other hand, there's a kind of failure that it's just a failure. I make these tiny little figures, which we'll talk about. They're incredibly labor intensive. I model them in clay. I don't do them anymore. There was a period of maybe 5 years. I model them in clay. I have to wear several sets of magnifying lenses. I have to use a sewing needle. And with one, little involuntary jerk of my finger, I can wipe out a month of work on a nose or a whole face. And the only thing you can do then is just literally, dust yourself, pick yourself up, dust yourself off, and start all over again. And you just do it again, and you do it again, and you do it again until you get it right. So there's that aspect of failure as just like, well, just put your head down, do it again. And then there's the aspect of failure, which I think probably 90% of artists experience, which is this, overwhelming sense that your whole body of work has been a failure, that your whole life has been a failure, that you've wasted your whole life making these things that suddenly seem to you, or often seem to you, inadequate, incomprehensible, unappreciated by you and everybody else, expensive, an imposition. And that sense of failure, you can't work your way through, you can't fix, you can't turn it into something else, you can't transform it and salvage it. And the only thing I've found until fairly recently is that you just have to wait till that feeling passes, because at the same time, you're compelled to do this, you're not going to stop. And every feeling eventually passes. So you basically wait till enough time passes that you repress it and you go on. So those are the kinds of failures, I think, failure as a subject, failure as a happy opportunity, failure as like, do it again, do it again, do it again to get what you want. And then the failure you can do nothing about, will never be able to judge. And you just have to kind of wait for the feeling to pass so that you can go on.
So Jeanne, I may have an extra hair shirt in my closet. So if ever you want to share it, I'm very happy to pass it on to you. And it's kind of a nice thing to wear on occasion. It reminds me of our humanity. Two thoughts occurred to me. One, when you were talking about wiping, in an instant wiping out something, I thought of Giacometti, who struggled so mightily to bring these little effigy-like figures, into being. Only with the wrong twist and turn, they dissolve into dust. The other thing I'm thinking about too is that it's hard not to see rubber and think of something slapstick, flimsy, insubstantial. It doesn't want to stand up, really. It wants to fall down. So that brings us to humor, which I think for all of the shadows and all of the darkness and all of the questioning and all of the, philosophical quandaries, there is a bright streak of humor that runs through your work. And I also want people to know that Jeanne is the kind of person that has always sat at my art historical table because, and I've always included her, not always, but there have been these points where I've wanted her at a panel or in a situation because I knew that she would do an incredibly smart job. And we had a panel on humor that was organized at College Art back in 2007. And we were joined by Jean Antoni, Charles Long, Jane Hammond, and Fred Tomaselli. And it was a really, really great panel. And had Leon Golub been alive, Leon would have joined us. And Leon was someone that I think, Jean, I think I can safely say for both of us, gave us a portal into humor, which expanded our understanding of what that meant. And Leon was someone, you know, you think of Leon's work, The Interrogators, White Squad, Thugs and Punks. I mean, these are very serious and very monumental works. I had a conversation with Leon at one point around humor, and it was an amazing conversation, excerpts of which were published in Art in America not that long after he passed. And the one thing that came up, and in the history of art, you know, you think about humor, the manifestos, Baccioni, you know, Gabo, are serious business. Leon said to me, but Doug, he said, look at the images. He said, the art can be very humorous. So I think when it comes to objects, and I think if we're talking about sculpture, locating the humor becomes an interesting proposition. I do want to quote Leon because we've mentioned him, and I think in deference to him, one of the things he said, which I thought was very profound, he said, one of the most fertile ways to visualize the future is from a somewhat comic point of view. I mean, in a sense, it might be freer than a tragic point of view. And coming from me, that's a statement. So Jean, let's talk about humor because it's a multi-dimensional polysemous envelope within which ideas develop.
Yeah, I mean, obviously humor is extremely important to me. I mean, and that makes it sound like I plan it. I don't. I mean, you know, the things that are funny in my work, and you know, and sometimes I'm the only one who thinks they're funny, unfortunately, they're not planned. I think humor is part of a kind of push-pull, a kind of ambivalence or ambiguity that is, you know, yes, things are dark and serious. On the other hand, things are completely and utterly ridiculous and funny. And, you know, yes, rubber is inherently funny, I think, or it can be. I mean, we make these goofy toys out of them, you know, that are often quite scatological, the thing that makes it sound like a fart, right? For instance, a rubber, right? So in addition to being like flesh and having industrial connotations, it's disobedient, the way humor is disobedient. Humor is really disobedient. It never obeys the rules, okay? And that's why it's anarchic. It breaks up the system. It can be insulting. It can be liberating, all of those things. So rubber is a little like that too. You can make it do a lot of things, but inherently it doesn't obey the rules. It's anti-authoritarian. I think humor is anti-authoritarian. And humor, you know, let's go to that old reprobate Freud. He said, humor is the id's way of saying, you'll never kill me. It's irrepressible, right? It's irrepressible. So, and Duchamp said that humor, he called it the corridor of humor. And I thought that was interesting. He was interested in the corridor of humor. He talked about humor as something to prevent him from getting bored. That's not why I am interested in humor. I'm not bored. But I like this idea of a corridor, that humor somehow, think of a corridor, is a way of transversing from one place to another place. And corridors often have doors off of them, which means you can be digressive. A humor can take you, can open a door on your right before you get to where you're supposed to go and take you into a whole other place. And so a corridor may be a straight line, but it can offer you lots of digressions. And for me, digressiveness and elusiveness and things that, don't go in a straight line, that are associative, are the most interesting things. So humor is like that, I guess. I think there's a lot more I want to say about humor, but right now that's all. I can't get anything more.
Yeah, that's fine. And Henry, let's go to the next slide because humor may come up again naturally.
Yeah.
The fly.
Yes, the self-portrait as a fly.
Self-portrait as a fly, of course. So Jeanne, you're going to tell us a little bit about how you made this, but I find this piece to be, it's the potency and poetry of smaller things. Give us a little insight into the process, which is consistently meticulous and rather obsessive.
Well, the really obsessive thing is that, as I said, I've been making these little tiny life-size flies by hand for years and years now, hundreds of them, hundreds and hundreds of them. And I make a little clay fly body, which I cast in rubber, and then I make the wings by pouring rubber and putting thread in and cutting out the shape, and then I attach it with more rubber. This is fly size stuff. So small as this is, I think it's like 5 inches long or something like that. It's actually an enlargement. It's an enlargement of a fly. Flies are the things that come in when the walls collapse that are both signs of dissolution, but also life and survival. And I could say a whole lot about why a fly. But if you want me to talk about how this was made, it was made in the same way. That is, I modeled in clay the body and made a mold and cast it in black rubber. I modeled not each leg, but each of the 3 different legs in clay, made a mold and cast them twice, one for each side of the body. They get attached to the body with more silicone rubber. The wings were silicone that I simply poured out into, I think, a plastic yogurt cup or something bigger than that, some sort of plastic takeout thing for the flat surface, untinted so it's clear, but I embedded these wires and threads in them, the wires to keep them stiff enough, the threads to keep the lines thin enough. They get attached with more silicone. The glasses are glasses I wore. These, this has become a kind of shorthand for self-portrait for me, these glasses. So I just put them on there, and then there's just, wire antennae. So that's how it was made. And I don't know if you want me to say more about flies and
well, flies tend to get a bad rap, but in some ways they're probably one of the most resilient of insects. When we're long gone, there'll be flies. But I think, given what went down not that many weeks ago during the debates, seeing the fly on Pence's head, let's go for it. Jeanne, tell us about the fly on Pence's head.
Well, as I said just recently, I mean, what's stunning to me about that is how insensate he must be that he couldn't feel this living thing on his head, or how terrified he must be to make a move and get rid of it, right? So that's what was so funny. The other thing that was funny is that, I've been using these flies forever, and a little bit like the chandelier, which actually begins to take on political meanings, when you're in the era of Trump and you're talking about truth and statements of fact and rationality, that's different from the meaning it had in the 90s. So too, suddenly these flies, which for me were not only about dissolution, but were about survival, as you say. And flies, oddly enough, sometimes pollinate flowers like bees. Very few people know that. So they're not just completely connected with destruction and dissolution, and symbolically and in literature and culture, they have all these meanings. I mean, you think of the difference between Emily Dickinson writing, "I heard a fly buzz when I died," on the one hand, and Descartes lying in bed, seeing a fly on the ceiling, and realizing that he could figure out the position of the fly from the coordinates of the ceiling, and invented the Cartesian coordinate plane. These 2 different approaches to the fly, et cetera, et cetera. Also, I've been so concerned, I talked about it a little bit with the chandelier. It'll probably come up later when I talk about the Frankenstein text, with the way in which rationality can go amok, the way in which indulgence in the belief in individual genius, which, as Borges said, is an illusion, can lead to, terrible excesses, right? There's a wonderful science fiction film, and I'm not necessarily a science fiction aficionado, but I saw it as a kid in 1956, and they remade it in 1986. It's called The Fly. And again, it's about the overweening hubris of the individual guy who thinks that he's brilliant, who is brilliant, and who ends up making a mess and turns in to be, to be this sort of hybrid of a person and a fly. I wasn't actually literally thinking of it when I made this piece, but it's been in the back of my head for years. So,
right. Yeah.
Yeah.
So Jeanne, I think, from The Fly to Lord of the Flies, it brings us from the hubris of individuals to the hubris of to a political environment. The one other thing I'd want to mention around this piece is creativity and commerce, which is, and I mention it here because of the smaller size of certain things that Jeanne has done, and things that fly in the face of spectacle, that are diminutive, that draw attention, but one has to get close. It's a little bit like a Ken Price cup, or, Richard Tuttle thread. These are things that don't call dramatic attention to themselves and have to be discovered in a way that's quiet, and they speak in whispers, in a sense, until you get close, and then they can shout at you. So Jeanne was on another panel that was around this theme, which creativity and commerce, that I hosted at the Albright Knox back in 2012. And I just want to read a couple of things that she said, because I think that they're really still incredibly germane. Jeanne, I don't know if you even remember, and excerpts of this were published in Art in America too in 2013. When everybody was talking about financial greed, Jeanne talked about creative greed, which I thought was fantastic kind of anecdote to the otherwise, one-dimensional side of a conversation. Creative greed being, artists will do anything. It's not financially based to achieve an idea, to get an idea made. But there were a couple of things that I just want to read that I think would be useful to know. She said, the idea of making a grand statement in any medium can be fraught with hubris. And here we are with this notion of hubris, whether it's a scientist trying to make something else, or, political systems that rise only to crumble. And then she said the dominance of money in the art world may enable the production of spectacle art, but it may also atrophy our ability to appreciate subtle, more intimate, and perhaps more difficult statements. And then one other statement. Art making, and this is really what it comes down to, art making is not a one-size-fits-all undertaking. Artists have different temperaments. Some are very comfortable with social networking, monumentality, and entrepreneurship. Others are essentially private and inward. There are a million mansions in the art world, just as there are a million ways of making art. It is possible to block your ears and eyes from the constant tally of sales and rankings, the media buzz around auctions, and the make or break reviews. This may be ostrich-like behavior, but it can also be a deliberate strategy of resistance against exclusionary narratives. Jeanne, do you feel any different about that now, or do you feel it's still a part of who you are?
Yeah, I think it's absolutely a part of who I am. And I don't know that I feel any differently about it, but I certainly feel that it has had a lot of repercussions, my saying that. Someone just once said to me recently, like, I've never met anybody so resistant to selling their work as you. And that's like, that came as a big surprise to me. I don't hate money. We all need money to survive. My only point was, and I think it's true, is that when money becomes the most important thing, when success is judged entirely in terms of money, when money is foregrounded, it has a tendency to elbow out other things, other ways of being. So if money quite, logically goes for bigger and better and more spectacle and more publicity and, more expansion, that's fine, but then it doesn't leave any room for work that, as you say, may be quieter, maybe more introspective, maybe more difficult. Not only does it not leave any room for that, and this is important, I think, it can atrophy our ability to even think differently, to think subtly, to accommodate works that might be difficult or digressive or somehow out of the acceptable norm. The art world is an extremely conformist place, which is an odd thing when you think about it. So if there's so much emphasis on commercial success, then we really lose our other abilities. And we've all seen now at this point the way in which the 1% of the art world, which is expanding, has had the unfortunate effect, probably not intentional on their part, of pushing out the 99%, not just of artists, but of galleries, of writers, of curators, so that they're all now scrambling just to survive. I mean, before they were scrambling to be seen and heard, but now we're all just scrambling to survive. So I think the situation has become much more intense. And it's a situation that's not echoed, but it's a smaller version of the situation in our country, obviously. So no, I don't think I feel any differently. I haven't changed my mind about any of that. I'm a little bit sorry I opened my mouth publicly. And I absolutely believe that it's got a lot to do with temperament too. I mean, this is not some stand I take out of a moral sense. I just can't do those things. And I know a lot of artists who can't do those things. Just no matter how hard I would push myself to, it wouldn't work, can't do it. And there should be a place for different kinds of temperaments and different kinds of artists. And that's what I meant by one size doesn't fit all.
Right, and a million mansions.
And a million ways of making art. I love the stories I love to tell my students, who are so young, is, it's never over. I could tell you so many stories about artists who everybody wrote off, and, who worked for 40 and 50 years in obscurity and suddenly became rich and famous. And the point is not that everybody should become rich and famous. The point is that during that time, before they were rich and famous, they were working, they were showing, they were, they were having professional lives. And just because they weren't, necessarily in the forefront of everybody's consciousness, doesn't mean that they weren't making art. Or as T.J. Clark says, you don't make the mistake of thinking the marginal is insignificant.
Right, exactly,
Yeah.
Jeanne.
Yeah.
And not only making art, but making art without the white noise of being in a different place. I would also say, just so that people don't get the wrong impression, the excerpts that I read, anybody who knows you knows that you're a very, one, reasonable human being, two, thoughtful human being. So whatever you would say would be tempered and buffered by a full view of that thing. So understand when you speak about the art world, it's not with malice, it's philosophical, which means that it's from a perspective of thought rather than critique in a way. And I would just mention that because you're a full-bodied human being, so to speak. Can we go to the next slide? Great. I mean, we could pick up on any number of threads here, but I want people to know that this piece was in an exhibition that was organized at the Albright Knox. I bought it acquired it for the collection. And it's a rather remarkable piece. The cloud is something that is worth addressing. I'll let Jeanne talk about the actual content. This is this portrait of her mum. But the cloud, there are clouds. There are weatheristic clouds. There are cyber clouds, and there are emotional and psychological clouds. All of those concern us. And, to quote Joni Mitchell, who looked at clouds from both sides, you know, she never quite understood them. So Jeanne, why don't let's try and unpack this a little bit for people in any direction you wanna run.
Well, I'll just start by saying this is my mother under a cloud, because she was depressed all her life, suffered from depression and anxiety. We didn't know enough to call it then, you know, that then, but it's so clear now that she was always under a cloud. So, you know, it's a very simple, straightforward illustration, if you will, of her emotional state. And I had been making a lot of work around this time that attempted to, again, give a body to the emotional feelings in the studio, feelings of anxiety or thin-skinnedness or a depression or even the sweat of labor. I was basically, and here we have issues of enlargement and reduction again. I was enlarging in fairly large rubber pictures, microscopic views of, say, a sweat pore or the bacteria that causes ulcers. You know, that we somaticize our emotions. So we do have pictures of emotion. And the first small figure I made was basically of myself, because I was interested in the way in which we are so much dwarfed by our emotions. Our emotions are outsized, and we ourselves are like this in relation to them. This piece came out of that. Who else was in the studio with me? Well, my mother, of course. She's in my head all the time. She is. And her emotion was anxiety. And rather than an internal organ, I thought of this cloud because, again, so much of my imagery comes from reading comic strips as a kid. You know, the light bulb was the cartoon source. And, you know, I looked at little Abner as a kid, not knowing, of course, at that time that it was an incredibly politically reactionary comic strip, Al Cap did. But visually, it was very interesting to me. And there was a character who had a constant cloud over his head. He has an unpronounceable name. It's all consonants. His first name was Joe. And, you know, he basically was this good-hearted, well-meaning guy who brought bad luck with him no matter where he went. And then we had Pigpen, Charles Schultz's character, whose cloud is not over his head, but it constantly surrounds him. So in some ways, the cloud comes out of cartoon world. But as you say, this is also it's a very sculptural cloud. You can't put your hand through it like a meteorological cloud. It's the opposite of mist and air. It's physical, it's heavy, it looks like a rock, it's dripping. And, you know, that's meant to be, again, an objective correlative for how it feels when it feels like literally the atmosphere is a physical weight on you. But it's also, just to go way, way back again to some of the first rubber pieces I ever made, when I was trying to give a body to thought, and I made rubber light bulbs, I also made 2 rubber thought clouds, which were based on all the clouds the Bernini saints stand on. And if you look at them, they look like stone and rock also. So they were a combination of the clouds that Bernini's saints stand on and a little hook like the one that connects the cartoon thought bubble to the character's head. So, I mean, in a way, this goes back to, you know, it doesn't especially look like a Bernini cloud, but that kind of physicalization of clouds as, you know, almost as rocks, so something heavy and dripping. They're visceral. It makes it visceral. So again, like an idea which seems insubstantial, but it actually does come out of the body. So to this feeling of depression, which you can't touch, it has weight. You feel it. It's substantial. It's physical. It's visceral. It drips. It can crush you.
Very good. Okay, let's go on to the next slide. So, Jeanne, it takes an enormous amount of time to create a piece such as this. Jeanne's been copying texts, rewriting texts by, you know, well-known canonical, sometimes not canonical texts in invisible ink. the notion of time is an interesting one, given our digital age and given the assault of technology. And time may well be the one thing that we need to self-reflect. Jeanne, you talk to us about what it's like to tackle Frankenstein, Mary Shelley's text, how long it took you, and in the process of doing it, what you were thinking about.
I don't remember how long it took, but I believe that I noted the time in the text. So somewhere in there, the time is accounted for. It took forever, obviously. And maybe I'll talk first about why Frankenstein, then I'll talk about writing and what that means and visibility, sure, because we're going to address that in the next slide as well. The reason I chose to copy in invisible ink, in longhand, Mary Shelley's Frankenstein is because it was, again, dealing with all these issues that the chandelier brought up. And in fact, I showed this with the chandelier once again, brought out a year ago in February, because she is writing basically about, at the beginning of the scientific revolution, about, rationality gone amok. Again, about the cult of the individual genius being, leading to disaster, leading to monstrosities if it's unchecked. And she is literally not attacking, but, sort of registering lots of reservations about the Enlightenment principles that are holding the middle of the stage at this time. Her father, Godwin, was a proponent of the Enlightenment, and she took issue with him. So, for all those reasons, the way in which rationality and irrationality and reason and science and the individual genius play out in this book, it was irresistible to me. Plus, she was a woman. She was, the daughter of one of the most famous of the early feminist polemicists, Mary Wollstonecraft. She was herself a Promethean rebel in that she was a political radical. She suffered social ostracism because she was married illegally to Percy Shelley. He died young. She lost children. She was poor. She wrote this because she was challenged to write a ghost story. So I love the idea that I was sort of ghosting her ghost story. And also, so it's an homage too. Okay, so all of that, I don't know if I've left anything out there, and why Frankenstein is why I chose this text. But in terms of writing invisibly or writing at all, I'll just answer the questions you asked me, and then we can talk later about how it started. I know a lot of people think that this is incredibly masochistic. All this labor that nobody can see. I mean, you can see this only because it's under UV light. In regular light, it's blank pages, right? Why would you do that? Well, there are a lot of reasons why, but let me just address the masochism aspect of it. I don't think I quite knew when I started, but when I started to do this project, which is kind of massive, there are at least 30 texts written out. I realized that I was falling into this hypnagogic state, and it was like the Proustian Madeleine for me. Maybe because I grew up writing in longhand so much, maybe because what some scientists are saying is actually true, that there's some sort of connection between your hand and your brain. But I wasn't literally, although I was copying out this text, I wasn't reading the text. Instead, I was flooded with memories, things that had never been memories before. For instance, a fragment of a conversation with my father, which I remembered for the first time since it had happened 50 years ago. And just one memory after another would just come over me as I was writing. So it was an extremely wonderful experience. And in terms of time, yes, it was time lost, time expended, but it was also, in the Proustian sense, time recovered. And as you say, time is all we have. And so the idea of having these repositories of things that look empty, but in fact contain time, that was interesting to me too. Maybe we should go to the next slide.
Yeah, let's go to the next slide. Jeanne, I wrote down several words, and Henry, we can go to the next slide. Quixotic, obsessive, erudite, meditative, and least we should not think therapeutic.
Yeah. Well, I think I covered the therapeutic part. Quixotic, well, yeah, I've been called perverse.
Not by me.
No, not by you. And I don't really necessarily mind being called perverse, but I just think I'm a deeply ambivalent person. And a deeply suspicious of authority. And, if you tell me to go one way, I will go the other. This, despite the fact that I'm probably the quintessential good girl in the world. But, I always want to do the opposite. So that's where the quixoticism comes in. And we've been talking about the market and the marketplace and money and art. And, as Barbara Kruger famously and truly said, no one's outside the marketplace. Nevertheless, I wanted to do something, invest huge amounts of time in something that would be a kind of resistance to the idea that time is money, money is product. And if time doesn't end up in money, then you've wasted time. I wanted something that wasn't so transactional, that was a little bit resistant to that. It's not to say that these things are for sale or can't be sold. They have in fact been sold, some of them. But I wanted that. I wanted something that talked about, there are things other than, producing what you can see, feel, and touch. I mean, it's a little bit like Bartleby the Scrivener, right? Who, in the Melville story, is fired. He's made redundant. He's laid off, and he won't leave. And he won't do anything. And he just simply says, "I prefer not to." So there's some of that in there, Also, it's also performative. I don't do performance. I'm too shy. But this is a performance. This is an ongoing performance. It's, it's an enacting of things. So I don't know if that covers everything that you were asking me.
It does. There's just one other thing, and then we'll move on. The notion of deep storage.
Oh yeah,
exactly. and emotional, truths that are personal and political, if possible, that are exhumed and discovered or repressed. So this idea of deep storage as a kind of repressed thought or emotion.
Yeah. I've been interested in the notion of storage in the studio as one aspect of invisibility, again, since the 80s, when I made a rubber painting that was, invisible because it was covered with cast rubber bubble wrap. And I, that goes on and on. Lots of things are in rubber bubble wrap. That's a real tongue twister. But what I started doing about, 2007 was making a functional rubber crate for each work that I would make. So that the work gets stored in the crate, it gets shipped out in the crate. And then once unpacked, the crate often becomes the pedestal for the piece, or at least becomes part of the exhibition because it's the sculpture itself.
And Henry, we can go to the next slide because that is what Jeanne's talking about.
Yeah. So here's an example of one. All of the things on top of the crate get stored in the crate, shipped out in the crate, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So anyway, yes, deep storage, which is, I borrow the phrase deep storage from Ingrid Schaffner, who did a fabulous show called that. But that kind of invisibility, one aspect of what's hidden in the studio revolved around storage. So when, I started to write these invisible texts, and I don't want to get too anecdotal about how that happened, but it was the suggestion of a friend that would collaborate on something. Anyway, I immediately thought of storage. Where do you put these things once you've written them? And there's always 1,000 sheets of paper, no matter how long the text is that I've written, so that when you're looking at it in regular light, you don't know where the written on pages end and the blank pages begin. Anyway, I thought of not a crate, which I'd already begun making, but we store papers in cardboard boxes. And so that's when I started making the faux cardboard boxes with the faux duct tape. And as I said, there are about 30 of these now. And all the texts in there are not only written in invisible ink in longhand, which is itself disappearing, but they are about invisibility on some level, and in all kinds of ways. And some of them are written in invisible, disappearing languages like shorthand or Esperanto. And some of them are commission texts, but the overwhelming majority of them are texts like Ralph Ellison's Invisible Man, or yeah, I could go on. I don't want to list all the texts for you, as it is a huge number of them, but you can imagine there are texts that already exist in the world that are about invisibility on some level that I've written out.
The only other thing, and Jeanne, we can address this when we get to the collaborations, which will be the last part of our talk. There's a significant feminist subtext to the Invisibility Project, which you can talk about. The crate with skeletons has, and when I saw it at the Mark Strauss Gallery, I suddenly had this notion that the crate has become a grand stage for a kind of drama, human drama. And maybe it was the presence of the skeletons, but I think also the peach crate, which any audiophile would understand and remember as being really important to their record collection, right? So we collected records, and the coolest person had more than anybody, had more peach crates than anybody else. It was a perfect way to store records. They stood upright. In the analog age, that was gold. Now the peach crate is, like a lot of other things in the digital age, in disrepute. That is, it's no longer functioning. So in addition to a very poignant embrace by two human beings with boxing gloves who are skeletal, there is this kind of recognition of time passing on top of an art crate, which is probably the most, rarefied prop you could find. So Jeanne, let's talk about this piece, and then we'll head into the collaborations. There's a detail of the skeletons because we wanted you to see those as well. So maybe we can go to that and toggle back and forth as Jeanne's speaking.
Yeah, so there's the detail of the skeletons, and yeah, let's go back just for a minute to that one, and I'll say a little bit about the crates before we talk about the skeletons. And yes, yet another, as you say, the fruit crate is a disappearing item, oddly enough. I mean, it's still widely available, but I actually had to go hunt for one of these. When I first thought of crates, this was, and I had done this sort of rubber Venus flytrap piece, and I saw it with exactly this crate beside it. And that was years and years ago. And I never made it. Instead, I started making these functional crates, right? And as somebody pointed out to me, well, it's interesting because everything's collapsing and falling apart in your studio except the crates. And of course, the crates can't collapse, they have to function. This collapsing crate on top, which, as I say, is again, one of these many things that had been in my head for years that I wanted to make, hadn't got around to, was a way of having at least one crate that was as fragile as everything else in the studio. I mean, and literally, if you don't get that one slat in the right position and wiggle the rest, the whole thing will literally collapse into 2 dimensions. I mean, it really is fragile. So yeah, I wanted to say that your notion of this becoming a kind of stage is really interesting, because I do think that's happening. In the same show, there was another crate that had an effigy of Socrates as a robot, kind of running around like a chicken without a head, the opposite of how we think of Socrates. Another sort of anti-authoritarian thrust, I suppose. So yeah, there's starting to be dramas as opposed to, say, tableaus played out. And I hadn't thought of that before. But if we look at just the skeletons, this is clearly a drama being played out. And I don't think I need to say anything about this. This is such a self-explanatory image, except to say that the rubber boxing gloves, again, I made a pair of rubber boxing gloves for a kind of homunculus figure back in the late 80s. It's been around a long time. I mean, this is a very loving image. They're not fighting each other. They're fighting to stay alive. They're fighting to stay together. But that's obvious. I don't need to say that.
Yeah, no, and it's incredibly poignant and poetic. And the boxing gloves, I think, are interesting because, like the fly, it's resilience. So it's an embrace, it's a dance. There's a certain repose, but you know what? You're ready to get up and fight if you have to.
Yeah.
And I love that. The only other thing that comes up around this image is creativity and aging. And it's a topic that, you know, Jeanne knows that I've been deeply interested in, and I've been doing an enormous amount of field research, talking to artists across disciplines. You know, what is it like? That is, how does your practice change as you age? What's gained, what's lost? You know, Jeanne, in your interview with Joanna Isaac, at the very end, and this was in 95, 96, you know, you're talking about having to wear a magnifying device for your eyes, putting things on tables to move things around to make for easier access. You know, shit happens when you get old. It's rather unpleasant, some of it, but there are things gained as well. And I'd like to hear about the things gained, if you're able to talk about this.
Yeah, I think so. I mean, it's interesting. We had a little conversation about this beforehand, so I started to think about it. I mean, in a way, just as I've always been death obsessed, I've always been obsessed with what kind of art could you make from your hospital bed? So that's always been on my mind. The pluses, though, of aging. They're different. Again, as I said, there are different kinds of artists. There are different temperaments. And so I look at people my age and people who are, you know, my colleagues who are 10, 12, 15 years older than I am. I'm 70, which is a shock to me when I go into a medical appointment and see a folder that says female age 70. I think, whose is that? You know, it's a shock. But I'm 70, but I have friends who are in their 80s, and they're no less engaged with the world. Not only with their work, their energy is undiminished in their work, but also still, you know, just as engaged with the public in terms of their world. I've never been very comfortable with that. You know, I tend to be reclusive. And I think you talked about my being under the radar. I really think that's the reason. More than anything else, is that I've always had a very difficult time with things like even phone calls, or I've only applied for 2 things in my whole life, one, and they're 30 years apart, asking for things, making demands, you know, and in the art world, because of this cult of the individual genius, you know, and the hubris of artists, there's this kind of acceptance that the more demands an artist makes, the more they are a genius. So there's that. And that has plagued me in the sense that I feel guilty. I feel guilty that I don't do more, that I brought this on myself, this whatever. But what I really love, what is like drinking cream to me, is being alone in the studio with my work. So I think one wonderful thing of aging is that I hope, I believe I'm beginning to let go of the guilt of not being able to do certain things that are entrepreneurial in the art world, and just accept that. And instead, you know, time is running out. I just want to be in my studio with my work. And that's a wonderful, pleasurable thing to look forward to and to begin to implement. The other thing is, and I know you're going to accuse me of wearing a hair shirt again, is that, you know, I mentioned the overall sense of failure, that I'm not alone in feeling that. Oh, my whole life has been wasted on making these stupid things, right? And what was the point? And I should have done something more useful, and blah, 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 blah. And lately I've begun to feel that, this is going to sound, I'm sure, extremely strange. No, there's a really good reason. I have a friend who has a wonderful phrase. She talks about the artist's daily doggy bowl of humiliation. There's so much rejection. There's so much, you know, whatever, invisibility. There's so many glittering prizes within reach, without reach, all this stuff, right? But recently I've begun to think, no, we really, I know a lot of people don't like the notion of humility because they think it's, like Uriah Heep. It's somehow hypocritical, or it's, whatever. But it's actually, we are really specks. We know that, right? Think of the universe, think of us in relation to the universe, think of the short lifespan, everything eventually goes away. The whole universe is probably going to disappear, as I understand it, from the latest, bulletin from the world of physics, right? So, actually living a life as an artist, under the radar, however you want to call it, is a way, it's an existential thing that in the end is a great life lesson about exactly how unimportant we are. I mean, we go on, we need to do this, it's important. I'm not saying that art isn't life affirming, but I'm saying that in the end, we're quite tiny. We're specks. And so I'm starting to come to terms with the fact that a whole life spent learning that lesson can't be too bad.
I love that, Jeanne. And also being an artist is an amazing way to self-realize, because it never stops. And it's bound to be existential. It's built into the very fabric of being a creative person. Whether it's failure or success. I think where it gets complicated is where systems intervene, where one has to enter a system that is not of oneself, but is parallel or, another universe entirely. That's where some of the more interesting issues come up. Let's press on. We've got one more slide, and then we're going to get into a discussion of collaboration, which is what Jeanne's been doing a lot of. Jeanne, we'll pick up the pace a little bit because it's a little after 2 o'clock now.
Oh my goodness, okay.
Okay, so with the collaborations, we maybe just kind of talk about them kind of as a general piece. But I wanted people to see, at least we think that Jeanne, is enmeshed in a dark universe, that color and a certain lushness enter her palette. That is her sculptural palette. So here's a piece that's, actually sculpture in the realm of painting with a funerary requiem-like frame, but which has a certain lushness, which may bode for nature coming up on top after all of the humans are gone.
Yeah, indeed. I think I mentioned that, in my very literal vision of the studio walls collapsing and their ruin and nature coming in. So I begin to make, again, sort of tableaus that represent this, weeds coming up, dandelions coming up through the floorboards, et cetera. So here's a version of that, only it's on the wall, and it's called knothole, as if you're looking through a knothole, but that's too literal. So there are in fact quite a lot of what we might call floral, so-called floral paintings in 3D, or floral tableaus, and quite a lot of them. This is just one example. But I think you wanted me to talk about materials and process here also. Am I correct?
You can dig into that a little, sure, and then we'll proceed.
And we'll move on. Just to say that I've moved through every kind of rubber known to us, until I finally hit on platinum silicone rubber, which allowed me to attach one thing to another. And it revolutionized my work because I could become additive. So for instance, in a piece like this, each dandelion petal has a separate mold that I model in clay. I make a mold, I fill it with phosphorescent pigment, and then that petal gets attached to the next petal with platinum silicone rubber. Each leaf has a different mold, although some of them you can see are repeated. Each insect, like the fireflies at the top, there's a mold for the front of the body, which is cast in black. There's a mold for the back of the body, which is cast in phosphorescent rubber. The wings are made in that elaborate way I described that I make the fly wings. Everything is made in this tiny little part and attached to everything else. And lest you think that I only work in rubber, because yes, mainly I do, but I do other things, video and photo and stuff like that. There's actually thread in this too. So the dandelion clocks in here are made out of thread. So that's just to talk a little bit about materials and process, that's all.
Very good. So let's carry on and go to the last section, which are the collaborations. And Jeanne, let's why don't you tackle this in a kind of general setting in terms of your collaborators.
Okay.
We'll talk about each project, but kind of give us some general statements around why collaboration matters to you.
Okay. Yeah. I wish I could do justice. There are 3 examples of collaboration here. About 5 years ago, I started doing a lot of collaborations with other women artists. What you're looking at now is a wonderfully, in terms of my experience, wonderful collaboration I did with Elaine Rychek, which took up actually 5 rooms, if you include the rotunda of the Addison Gallery. And we had tried to collaborate earlier, didn't work out. And I was doing the invisibility project. And I said, why don't we join forces on that? So we did, because her work too had aspects of invisibility in it. And I won't go into detail now, I'd love to, but we're running short of time. You're looking at just one room. And on the rear wall here is one of Elaine's samplers. She also was text-based, so it made sense that way. And I don't want to go into too much detail. I forget which invisible texts are in my boxes there, but there's the old rubber light bulb again, and et cetera, et cetera.
And Elaine's text is from Camus, L'étranger.
And
it's stitched, so they're incredibly intricate and beautiful, and what we see as black is actually much more complicated. But I was also thinking, Jeanne, and then we can go to the next, is that you had an email correspondence with Elaine, which was really, really great, and the catalog that the Addison published was quite handsome and
beautiful.
Really
won a prize. It was so beautiful. Yeah. And those email exchange, I mean, the sparking off of ideas between us was, one of the most wonderful experiences of my professional life. Yeah.
Next slide, please.
Okay, and so now I'm involved in 2 collaborations. One with the wonderful Susan Unterberg. We were talking about invisibility. It has just recently, in the past year and a half or so, come out of the closet as the donor, the inventor and the donor of the Anonymous Was a Woman grant. She's also quite a wonderful photographer in her own right, and lately she's been making artist books about the Trump era of politics. So when we decided, again, I said, let's collaborate. We decided to do a book. So we're doing a book on environmental concerns. We're using the New York Times as a basis. I'm doing literally drawings on the weather map that occurs every day and writing in quotations from things like the invisible man who's stealing light from a monopolated electric and power company. Whereas in the next slide, you'll see that Susan is working with the image in the story itself, digitalizing it, and then working very quickly to collage onto it, change the colors. And in terms of text, she tends to be staying with the text of the headline. But her aim is to work very fast so she can respond very quickly. We are going to do a year's worth of this. It's called the Disaster Diary. I think that gives you some idea of what it might look like when it's finished. She works fast, I work slow, but we're coming along with that. And then the very last image that I want to show you is the collaboration I'm working on now with wonderful sculptor Bonnie Richlack. We made this piece together for a show about collaborations, but we're also doing a show that opens in January at the University of Georgia called Down and Dirty, and which is going to travel to a couple of other places where, unlike this piece, the rest of the work is not necessarily made collaboratively, but the whole idea of the show is collaborative. This notion, she's interested in drains, which hide, again, what's repressed, what's hidden, what's unpalatable. I've been interested in pipes. And anyway, another beautiful catalog is coming out that we've collaborated on, et cetera. And why collaboration? Well, I've been talking about invisibility and its connection to issues of being a woman or being anybody who's marginalized, subaltern, who gets seen and who gets heard. Well, collaboration is a way of becoming visible. First of all, as in the Dickinson poem, "Are you nobody? Who are you? Are you nobody? I'm nobody too. There's a pair of us, don't tell us." They'd advertise, Well, as soon as there are 2 nobodies, there's somebody. So you're not alone, for one thing. And then, you know, of course, you're sparking off each other. It's expansive. It's company in the cold shadow of the increasingly corporate art world. It's cooperative. I think women are kind of naturally cooperative, which isn't to say they aren't competitive, but they have a kind of natural cooperative quality. It feels holistic. It just feels right. I've been really enjoying it. And I think that oddly also ties into getting older. You know, as you know, you sort of let go in a way of your, you know, your beloved independence. You know, I don't know. It's fun. It's just fun. It's fun. It's creative. It's warming, and I'm really enjoying collaborations. And I was not capable of it when I was younger.
Fantastic. Great. So Henry, let's open up Q&A.
Great, thank you both so much for the extremely thoughtful conversation. Thank you, Jeanne, for sharing so much about your work and your interests and your processes. It's very difficult to not find solace in your work. And thank you, Douglas, for like rightly pointing out that it is extremely therapeutic, especially in this kind of distressing intellectual period. And then also, you know, in a larger way, and its like kind of impulse to confront the existential. I think that's kind of not appreciated, in my opinion, as much as it could be. So we were talking about materiality moments ago, and we got a question from Karen Schiffino in the audience. She says, I'm wondering if silicone rubber will last over time. I know that Eva Hess's rubber work is deteriorating right now, and I'm hoping your work can remain over time, as wonderful as it is now. Karen is, Karen is also interested in how the ephemeral materiality might introduce themes in your work surrounding time.
Hi, Karen. Thank you so much for that question. Yes, short answer to the question of platinum silicone rubber and why, you know, it's been such a relief to me to use it. It's non-toxic. It lasts indefinitely. Probably forever, and maybe that's not a good thing. And you know, for all the other reasons I mentioned, it's great for me to use. But yes, it's archival and non-toxic. I started out using latex, as did everybody before there were these other rubbers, and I loved latex too. It's a perfectly natural material. It's the sap of the rubber tree. You get it from dandelions, of which I have a lot in my work. Dandelions produce latex, but of course it wasn't considered archival, and it isn't unless you do certain things to it. I have done certain things to it, like filled it with shredded fabric and put acrylic paint into it. So I still have a huge number of those early latex pieces, but a lot of them were lost. Which I didn't care about at the time. I was young. What? Oh, they last 3 years. That's fine. Who cares? You know, I probably want to be alive in 3 years. You know, I was just a callow. I didn't have any sense that these things should be saved. Today was good enough. But then as time went on, and you know, people began to pressure me for my own good, I suppose, to use a more permanent material. Museums were reluctant to buy things in latex. I turned to industrial materials like polysulfide rubber, which is extremely toxic, so I couldn't do it myself. I had to take my mold to a fabricator. And the problem with that was that it develops cold flow. So after 4 or 5 years, these pieces literally do this. They just, you know, they respond to gravity. So a number of pieces were lost that way, although I've tried to retrieve some of them by remaking them, like recasting the collapsed one and remaking them, but that, you know, I don't have enough time to do that. Then I turned to UV rubber, which I could again make myself. It wasn't terribly toxic, although I took precautions, but there were lots of problems again with, if you put color into it, you had to overcome the color of the rubber, and over time the rubber would revert to its ordinary color, which was a kind of orangey thing. You could not attach other things to it, and it too wasn't that long lasting. It would crack things. So that was a very long answer to your question, but yes, platinum silicone rubber. I was delighted to finally get to it, and it is archival. Yeah.
Great, thank you. We're now going to move to the always sharp Lynn Crawford. You should be able to unmute yourself.
Okay. Hello,
Yeah, we can hear you. Yeah.
thank you so much for your amazing work, which has been an inspiration to me for very long. And it's thanks for this great presentation. Given your interest in the body and also with collaboration, I'm wondering when you're copying Frankenstein, if that's almost a way for you to not only involve your body, but maybe in some way collaborate with the author of the text.
Yes, that's, sorry, go ahead, please.
No, that was basically.
Yes, I'm so glad you asked that question. Yes, first of all, it is a bodily action. As I said, at a certain point, much as I love to have stuff because my shoulder hurts, I carried it for so long, right? So you're very aware of your body in that sense. Plus, I have Frankensteinian notions of the body in terms of representation of the body too. I sometimes cut them up and they're very kind of Frankensteinian. But more to the point, your issue about it's bringing me perhaps closer to Mary Shelley.
Yeah.
Yes. I mean, even though, as I said, I'm not necessarily reading the text as I write it because all these memories are coming up. It's really an act of homage to me. I mean, you could see it as a kind of hostile erasure, taking her text and making it invisible, but I don't see it that way. First of all, I'm spending all this time copying it out word for word. And so for me, it's a real homage. And I don't think it brings me closer to, her creative process because, as I said, I'm not necessarily reading it, but it makes me feel very close to her. It makes me feel like I'm giving a gift back for the gift that she gave to me.
Yeah, it's beautiful. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Lynn. I would love to ask my own question, if that's all right.
Yeah.
Just thinking about a couple kind of threads of thinking that run through this conversation, especially like the equivalence that you drew between monetary greed and artistic greed. And then also the Enlightenment. I couldn't help but ask you about your thoughts of the kind of expansionism of Enlightenment art that's predicated on the Enlightenment or made in the last 300 years, or even the avant-garde of the last century. And something I have felt personally is just this kind of expansion and this exploration that is productive for sure, but I do feel that there's a point, especially younger generations of artists are having to face other kind of trajectories in art beyond just expansionism. And so I'd love to hear your thoughts, or if you have any instructions for the younger artists.
Yeah, lots of good things in there, especially the notion of a younger generation that I'd like to talk about. Yes, I mean, we've been, in a way, in a wondrous explosion of art, especially in terms of sculpture. I think all kinds of new things. Technologies have made things available to us. Spectacle, much as I have my reservations about it, it has produced amazing things. It's a real explosion that technology has allowed us to make. Sculpture has always been susceptible to moving forward through technology, from the invention of bronze to the portable welder that was made available after World War II that allowed people to weld on the spot sculpture, to the digital, right? So yeah, that's been great. I don't know if we want to call it in terms of the Enlightenment notions of progress and moving forward, and invention being wonderful. All that is wonderful. We are in an amazing period. But at the same time, all of those things are costing us. Spectacle costs a lot of money. It has a huge environmental footprint. You need a huge amount of support as an artist to do it. If you are interested in the internal as an artist, you can't make big things by yourself. Even I can't make things totally by myself. I need help. Can't lift certain things, things like that. So all those things cost money. And as younger artists, you guys, I'm sorry, and the younger generation has been fucked over so badly. I've been saying it for years. A lot of people have been saying it for years. The way in which that you have been forced into debt for educations that have been dubious to begin with. I mean, you've just been fucked over. And now we have a pandemic, and we're going to have, and then are experiencing a huge economic crisis. So that, you know, this constant expansionism, I suspect will come back after the pandemic is over, but it will not be available to 99% of artists. And so, you know, yeah, you guys are going to be faced with finding, if you will, what Doug called under the radar ways of operating. And that doesn't mean that you will never be known. It means that I think you're going to have to, and you are already, you know, God, you live in communal ways, you share studios, you know, it's a miracle to me that my students are able to remain in New York and continue to make work, and they do. They do. They're incredibly ingenious and inventive. But yeah, I don't know what kind of effect it's going to have on the larger art world, because there's still, you know, there's still going to be a lot of money around after we get out of this pandemic. It's interesting, the pandemic has all forced us, no matter who we are, to go back to working with our hands on the table without help, right? But I would hope that, and I hate to, you know, again, make this transactional, like you guys in the younger generation suffered so much. So maybe that will make the art world a better place. Like, but it would be lovely to think that, you know, what I've talked about as the elbowing out by people in charge with money and power, the elbowing out, not that they exist because they're producing this fantastic work on the one hand, but that elbowing out of quieter work, different ways of working, that maybe because there's so many of you who won't have access to that, that you will bring back an art that offers different alternatives, that offers different paths, that looks at things differently, that's perhaps more, a little less spectacular, a little more thoughtful. I'm sure that your concerns with the environment will be much more sensitive than our generation of artists has ever been. So I don't know if that answers your question or not, but.
Jeanne, I was, you know, hearing you speak too, I wonder if, you know, a lot of really amazing art has come out of abject circumstances. So to not have to think about money is to actually be in a space that enables you to do shit that could be rather subversive, and it may even enhance an activist sensibility. So I think it could be a very productive place to be, as long as one can tolerate the circumstances one finds themselves in and not feel like they're missing something.
Yeah.
Because therein lies, you know, the glimmer also that you spoke about, Jeanne. The glimmer has this kind of golden, almost like the pot of gold at the end of the art world rainbow. You know, you kind of want to grab that because it's like a presence that you're taught to aspire to, or depending on who your teachers are, you're not. That's the good news. So an acceptance of circumstance, knowing that one can be incredibly free.
Well, a couple of things. But the glimmer I was talking about was actually the glimmer of the idea, the glimmer of the next piece, the sort of will-o'-the-wisp of, oh, the next thing I'm going to do that keeps you going, right? That's the glimmer I'm talking about. And I think that's what keeps us all going.
And that's it. That's the creative glimmer.
That's the creative glimmer. And then, yes, necessity is the mother of invention. I think incredible. I think this is an opportunity for all kinds of new things, new wonderful things to happen. For you know, new ways of working. You know, you make things out of what you've got when you don't have anything, and then lo and behold, you've made something amazing because you were forced to work with materials you wouldn't have, you know, chosen. And I totally agree with you. I mean, you know, it would be nice if all our attitudes towards success, as it's seen in American culture, which is Sinclair Lewis pointed out long ago, and success in America is always commercial. It would be nice if our ideas of success changed. And that's how we would be content. I mean, we're never content, right? That's we're always restless. We're always disappointed with ourselves. We always want more of something, not necessarily money, not even necessarily attention, although that can be part of it. But you know, different. We really need to have different standards of success. We used to. Not that those were perfect either. They're far from perfect. Those old standards, like critical success. Remember that? Remember critical success? That doesn't exist anymore as apart from, and that's because of the devastation of the critical community who have suffered desperately from, you know, the capital, you know, the monetization of the art world and the incursion of the digital, and nobody's getting paid to write anymore. You know, I have my bones to pick with what has been considered critical success in the past, but you know, looking back on it now, that seems like so much better. So other standards of success, so that we're not always with our nose pressed to the window, looking at the goodies in there and feeling deprived. The community, you know, working with artists are wonderful communities. And you don't have to be, I mean, I'm not a very social person, but I have to say everything good that happened to me came out of other artists. And I say to young people all the time, you know, stay connected to each other. You are the ones who will make the art world.
Great, thank you so much. That was just an education. And here's to diamonds being born under pressure.
Yeah, good, nice one.
So we're now going to turn to our very own publisher, Fong. Take it away.
Thank you. Thank you, Henry. Thank you, Jeanne.
Hi, Fong.
Thank you so much for a very incredibly thoughtful and profound conversation with Doug.
Thank you.
And you touch a lot. I mean, obviously we can go on forever, but just in regard to teaching, also for young artists, young students, I just told a friend just the other day, quoting from Eleanor Roosevelt, who said, never mistake knowledge for wisdom. One helps you to make a living, the other one helps you to make a life. And I think making a life is impossible if you don't have the community.
Yeah.
It's very important. So that's just a comment on the community aspect, which is exactly what the rail is doing, you know.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
But I want to ask just a quick question, Jeanne. I know that you married to the quite well-known environmental lawyer, also a publisher and author, Robert Hammett Hernan.
Yes.
And I wonder whether the early interest in Shelley and the environment might have some rapport, dialogue with him perhaps.
Well, I had never thought of Shelley, and there are lots of you know, descriptions of the sublime through landscape in Frankenstein. So there are, you know, now that you mention it, there's an enormous amount of environmental issues to unpack in that novel. I hadn't thought of it in relation to my husband Bob's environmental activity. He was an environmental lawyer. He did pro bono work to close down landfills. He worked for the Environmental Protection Agency of New York and helped close down or helped recoup money from Love Canal. He wrote a book on, you know, and he, you know, yeah, he's an environmental activist, and he's a much better person than I am. He just is. He just simply is.
I people who admire his work, so that's why I knew about him.
Yeah. Yes. Yes. He's an extremely admirable person, and his work is amazing.
Well, I'm glad that you know, that was brought up. But when I remember seeing your show, David McKee, must have been in mid-90s, and the first response were, it seems to be the work been driven or calling upon to make as a mediation between the age of enlightenment, because you just talk so much about it, and on hand, and the other is really romanticism, you know. It's really both. So my second question in regard to Shelley and both Percy and Mary, And I wonder whether you have any in-depth dialogue with Donna Haraway, because, you know, she's trying her own work. You know, I remember the Signboard Manifesto was such a big deal.
Yeah.
When I first read it.
Yeah. Yeah, and for me too. And it's still extremely powerful for me. The idea of the cyborg as, you know, emancipatory.
Yes.
Although I also, you know, of course, worry to some extent about the extinction of the human, but, you know, and also think maybe we should go anyway, right? But romanticism is of great interest to me. And certainly Shelley, both Mary and Percy fall into the Romantic school of literature. And I think there's something, this may seem a little askew in terms of an answer, but it's what's coming into my head. You know, Doug and I have talked today and previously about internalizing things and miniatures. And I guess I see, like, you know, something small as, you know, kind of going inside and down, like in physics. The smaller you get, the more expansive the world gets, right? You go inside and it gets smaller and smaller. And as it gets smaller and smaller, suddenly there are 9 dimensions. And I've even heard 14 dimensions. And suddenly things that are not possible in the large world become possible in this expanded small world. You know, it's like literally like Alice going down the rabbit hole. Big becomes small. There's no rationality, there's no sense, no nothing. And the other thing is, to return to the issue of romanticism, that something about inwardness. I've done some pieces which are rubber, again, they're rubber pictures on the wall with embossed quotations about invisibility translated into Braille.
Yeah.
And there are lots of reasons for that. That have to do with invisibility, that have to do with tactility, that have to do with languages that not everybody can understand, and that may be lost as technology seems to be making Braille to some extent perhaps superfluous, I don't know. Anyway, it's something about the inner eye. There's not just an outer eye. And the Romantics always talked about the inner eyeball and what you see on the inside of the eyeball. And what you see on the inside of the eyeball, according to the Romantics, is emancipatory because it's hallucinogenic, because it's the, you know, it's Kubla Khan, it's you know, it's the world on drugs, yes, but it's where the rules don't apply anymore. It's phantasmagoric. And so, yeah, I can lament and mourn and worry about and criticize the problems of Enlightenment ideals and be sorry that they turned into the violence of the guillotine or the atomic bomb or whatever. And at the same time, lament the fact that right now what we want is some acknowledgement that there is such a thing as truth and lies, right? But at the same time, I love the idea of the inner world of the Romantics as a place where anything is possible, where it can be rational, irrational, going inside, if that makes any sense.
It does make sense. That's exactly why William Blake was beloved by Aldous Huxley or Timothy Leary and tons of other people.
Including me.
Me too. In fact, I was telling Kyle, my assistant, just yesterday, we were talking about Huxley and we were talking about the Doors, you know, how Jim Morrison died so young, 27 years old. And the name The Doors really came from the door perception. So I thought I'd throw it out there. But anyway, Jeanne, thank you so much for this amazing conversation. And congratulations on your show. I'm sorry you won't be able to go there and see it. Does it travel anywhere?
The one in Kentucky, no. The one that's happening in Georgia has a couple of venues lined up, and we're still working on some more. So.
Great. Oh, that's terrific. Congratulations. And Doug, thank you so much. I'm making Doug working all the time. It's unbelievable. I owe you my life, Doug.
Oh, Fong. Thank you.
Thank you, Doug.
Thank you, guys.
Jeanne, likewise.
You're amazing.
Back to you, Henry.
Likewise.
All right, moving on. At the Rail, we have a tradition of ending lunch with a poem. We've carried that into these community events, and today I'm thrilled to welcome today's laureate, Kate Colby, to the stage. Kate Colby is an award-winning writer whose work offers a unique blend of poetry, essay, and autofiction. She has authored 7 books of poetry, Fruitlands earning her the Poetry Society of America's Norma Farber First Book Award, and her work has been featured at the Beauport Sleeper McCann, De Cordova, Isabella Stewart Gardner, and RISD museums. She was a founding board member of the Gloucester Writers Center in Massachusetts, where she now serves on the advisory board. Kate, over to you.
Thank you. Thank you, Doug and Jeanne, so much for including me. And Jeanne, what a pleasure to be able to hear your talk and see your work and also witness your ardent fandom for Emily Dickinson, which I can feel the whole time. Several invocations. I'm just going to read a couple of poems from my most recent book, which is called The Arrangements. The image on the cover is Joe Bradley. And I was just going to read the title poem, but for every one of your slides, Jeanne, I thought, I have a poem for that. And I don't want to be too on the nose, but I just wanted to read this short poem for your black chandelier. It's called Broad Night. The only light is all around, full moon on each ice-locked twig, reflective mess with brutal stars in it. Love is distance, its reaches in your face, branching there. Here, chandelier of dependent prisms, what nimbus splits into and joins it. So that's kind of a Black love poem.
Thank you, that's lovely.
Fits your piece. I'm just gonna read the title poem, The Arrangements. A photo is mostly finished, but you can't consummate a painting in time. The eyes will follow till one of you is nearly exhausted, or a head in a crested conquistador hat appears from behind the holes. It grins. You die, no, lie next to me while I grind through the night. I want you to hold my hand across a rough surface and read me this song, but you have to get the words wrong. Dregs of the season depend from the trees, wet mats of leaves still being rained on. Loathe this cold, but hold it close. Let it get colder as things you intend to tell but won't. Apparent absence is presence enough for the moment. I will say this much for silence. To break it is to know what holds us here to the bone. Broken down on the road from you, red mist of budding trees, a clump of dead sumac, I think, to say the least. Day doesn't so much progress as condense. Rain fills red solo bowls for feral cats in the yard. If life could be saved, I'd take the lump sum, meaning all at once. After the beep on my answering machine, pedals pour down the street to the bay. See what I'm saying? It looks like a mouth. Steam curls from hosed concrete, thick silence, studded finches, crosswalks stutter, cut here. Nothing's clear enough to see through. Invisible windows come between and seem the same. Beauty's useless. Afternoon moon, a complete hole into which the eye grows its pupil. Are hours consumed or do they accumulate? Time is a trash bag, forever collecting itself. My cup, quenched teeth, clenched fist, screaming into it. Will you listen to that mouth on you, blowing trick candles you can't self-extinguish? To think you don't get to see your own innards, the number of breaths, do they even have a value if uncounted? Time exists if you buy it. You crank it out like an awning and stand under it, or don't. Standing next to it is not an option, though. Just try to go around a river. I try to experience my entrails, can't sleep for containing them. Is this the same or opposite as being in the world without eyes for the infinite? And then I'm just going to read just a few new short poems.
That was wonderful.
Thank you. The first is called Headlong. In the middle of my life, I found myself a field washed up on a beach. Clover, bees, the whole 9 yards of boundlessness. I'm a literal person of skin that shows the shape of my bones, no marble virtue, arm broken from the shoulder. But out in the cold fingered gloaming, what crawls down the side of its castle to sew my sucking wound wide open. Codicil. My ghost has grown a lot smaller than my outline, ripped from ragged fabric, holes for eyes, black or see-through, I can't say. In my Vedic utterances of yesterday, I had 2020 speech. I'm left a list of indices rattling around in my half-double helix. I am what's needed of my own erasure. Take all the empty cans of air on top of Everest, a hollow cairn of barrenness, the half moon finished to begin with. All fall, the hurricanes break up overhead, flicker on the floor, far beneath, star-nosed and crepuscular. I root for seeds I need to grow, bend and be also broken. Headhunter. Marooned here in its reaches, my fletchings sing distance like geese. Nothing is complete. Deep sky, droning plain, a mess of feathers with some flesh on them. The world is only here to see through, eye threads, sky bones of glass pipettes. Untold sailors leave their wrecks, commando crawl the ocean floor to the beach where I meet them, grasping at claws. How I look in the mirror. One day I will have lived between 2 points in time, but how many in space? That which describes what it displaces, head, flag, beach, bucket, this isn't right. What is displaced by described light? To survive means to be alive, despite what nearly took you or did the dead. My face full of arrowheads pointing at, don't say, don't talk to me like that, like that. Thank you.
Thank you, Kate. That's wonderful.
Thank you so much, Kate. Thank you, Jeanne and Doug. And thank you to everyone who tuned in today. Please join us tomorrow at 1 p.m. for our 15th Radical Poetry reading, curated by the poet Tongo Eisen Martin and featuring political poetry read by Mimi Tempest, Michael M.J. Jones, Daria Simpson, and Melanie Clay. I'm going to unmute everyone so you can all shout your thank yous.
Thank you, Jeanne. Thank you, Doug.
Thank you, everybody.
Thanks, Jeanne.
Thank
Thanks,
you.
Doug.
Much, Jeanne.
Okay.
Thank you, Kate.
Thanks, Doug.
Lovely reading.
Hey,
Great. Thank you so
Thank
much.
you, everyone.
thank you, Doug. Thank you, Doug. For
Great reading, Kate.
Thanks.
Yeah.
for reading. Thank you, Kay. Thank you for the poetry reading.
Thank you.
Guys, hello.